Most people in Oberhausen knew Frank Gust as quiet. A little awkward, maybe, but polite. The kind of man who kept to himself, who fixed motorcycles, and didn't raise suspicion. But behind that ordinary facade was something unspeakable, something that had been brewing for decades, long before anyone had a name for it. This isn't the story of a sudden snap or a man pushed too far. This is the story of someone shaped by silence. A child whose earliest memories were abandonment and cruelty. A boy who, from a frighteningly young age, felt excitement not from toys or cartoons, but from blood and control. By the time anyone realized what Frank Gust had become, it was already far too late. Because he didn't just fantasize about death, he studied it, practiced it. Until the lines between life and corpse, between animal and human, didn't matter anymore. And it all started with a guinea pig. Born in Oberhausen on May 24, 1969, Frank's life began in instability. His biological father drank heavily and vanished early in Frank's life. His mother, unable to manage on her own, worked full-time and placed him in institutional daycare during the week. That meant Frank came home only on weekends, a critical stage of emotional development spent mostly among strangers. He grew up with a brother and under the care of a grandmother. Once she fell ill, a new stepfather moved in around 1977 when Frank was around 8 years old. And there was more going on than anyone realized. When Frank stayed with his grandmother, his main caregiver at times, he was repeatedly mistreated by children in the neighborhood. They humiliated him in cruel ways. One incident involved having sweets smeared on his private parts, followed by a dog being made to interact with him while others mocked him. These weren't isolated moments. They happened again and again. He was repeatedly hurt, shamed, and left alone to process it all. Even more disturbingly, reports from forensic experts, including Thomas Miller and Petra Klages, note that Frank was sexually abused in repeated occasions by a known pedophile neighbor of his grandmother. Some accounts suggest he may have been exposed to several other men who sexually abused him when he was at the neighbor's house. This all happened before he was 9 years old. Far too young to understand, let alone protect himself. The people who were supposed to keep him safe either didn't notice or chose to look away. His grandmother, herself reportedly affected by trauma in her own youth, offered little comfort. She once instructed him casually to kill a guinea pig. He was only about 9. He tried to crush it with a concrete block, missed, and then cut it open. Frank would later call this a turning point. He said he felt a powerful sensation, not fear, not disgust, but something dark and thrilling as he handled the animal's insides. That moment lodged itself in his brain like a splinter. From there, things escalated quickly, and how he felt an intense, disturbing lust in handling the warm entrails. He later called it a key experience. Over the next years, the cruelty escalated. Rabbits stolen from neighbors, then larger animals. In his teens, he began breaking into the mortuary at Oberhausen Cemetery to cut open corpses, seeking sensations he couldn't get from living things. These acts merged sadism, control, and necrophilia into a dark fantasy that grew with time. By his teens, he had already decided this wasn't just something he wanted to do. It was something he needed to do. He earned a hunting license legally, giving him access to animals. He even started seeking out strays. At some point, his actions took on a ritual quality. He wasn't impulsive, he was methodical. He knew how to stalk, capture, cut, and arrange. And still, no one intervened. At school, he kept to himself. Teachers described him as shy, maybe a little withdrawn. He didn't have many friends. He didn't cause trouble. But while others were going to parties or trying to fit in, Frank was visiting cemeteries at night. He snuck into funeral homes. He opened coffins, not to grieve, but to touch. to examine, to feel something cold and lifeless under his hands. He'd later admit that the silence of those places, the stillness, was deeply arousing to him. Psychologists would later say that his early experiences had left him completely detached from empathy. Where others saw suffering, he saw opportunity. He didn't view others as equals. He saw them as objects. And those early humiliations, the betrayals, the abuse, the neglect, had carved a void inside him. A void he spent years trying to fill in the worst possible ways. He began writing down his thoughts, fantasies about women in their final moments, obsessions with what it would feel like to hold someone's heart as it beat for the last time. He was rehearsing, preparing, waiting for the moment when fantasy wouldn't be enough anymore. And when that moment finally came, the world learned what Frank Gust had truly become. But long before that, before the first woman vanished, before the headlines, before the trial, there was a boy crying out in silence, and nobody listened. His childhood wasn't just difficult, it was damaging in ways that left deep scars. And while that doesn't justify anything he did later, it's an important part of understanding how someone like Frank Gust is formed. According to psychologists who studied his case, Frank Gust's early emotional damage played a key role in shaping who he became. The constant separation from caregivers, combined with both physical and sexual abuse, left him feeling powerless and isolated. He didn't have strong emotional bonds or stable guidance. He was punished harshly for behaviors he didn't understand, and over time, his pain turned inward. Eventually, something shifted. He stopped seeing himself as the victim and began to crave control. Hurting other living things gave him a sense of power he never had as a child. Experts say this stage, where someone starts testing boundaries by harming animals or seeking out morbid situations, is something they often see in individuals who go on to commit serious crimes later in life. People wonder, why didn't he stay away from the neighbor? Why didn't he avoid the other kids? But Frank was a child, alone, neglected, emotionally starved. He wasn't choosing danger. He was growing up inside it. The man who hurt him wasn't a stranger. He was someone in the neighborhood, someone trusted. And the worst part? Nobody intervened. So Frank kept going. Because no one told him not to. Because no one protected him. Because no one ever said, "You deserve to be safe." He didn't have protective adults to shield him. He was likely emotionally desperate for connection, even unsafe ones. He may have felt trapped, confused, or powerless, and possibly he had nowhere else to go. Between 1994 and 1998, Frank Gust murdered 4 women. His crimes were brutal, disturbing, and ritualistic, but what made them even more terrifying was how well he managed to hide in plain sight. During those years, Gust lived a double life. By day, he worked in construction. He repaired roofs and made a living with his hands. Quiet, dependable, just another tradesman in the industrial Ruhr region. He even had a girlfriend. They lived together and eventually got married. To those around him, he was odd but functional. He liked working on motorcycles, kept to himself, and didn't seem threatening. No one suspected a thing. But behind closed doors, Frank Gust was becoming something else entirely. The first known victim was a 28-year-old woman from South Africa, living in the Netherlands, traveling through Europe in 1994. She accepted a ride and never arrived at her destination. Her decapitated body was discovered in a forest area near Ede in the Netherlands. Gust later admitted he mutilated her, severing her head and arranging the remains so they could be found shortly after the murder. In 1996 and again in 1998, he picked up 2 prostitutes near Essen Central Station. After luring them into his vehicle, he murdered them. Both cases involving extensive mutilation and at least one involving sexual assault. Their bodies were left in locations where discovery was likely, reflecting his desire for immediate exposure of his work. His presumed final victim was a 47-year-old woman, described by investigators as a relative of his wife, killed in 1998. Her body was never found. Although Gust's conviction included her murder, based on confession and supporting evidence, and the assumption he placed the mutilated remains in a discoverable state, though they never were recovered. All 4 murders share hallmark features of sexual sadism and necrophilia. Gust had a legal hunting and firearms license by his early 20s, which he initially used to kill larger animals, but eventually he turned those methods toward human victims. He described that he derived power from mutilation and control, the cutting, the gutting, the arrangement of bodies. He even spoke about a dark fantasy of touching a dying woman's still-beating heart. Gust's modus operandi was deliberate and ritualized. He abducted vulnerable women, often prostitutes or travelers, killed them, mutilated them, and arranged their bodies to be found promptly afterward. The sadistic escalation from animals to humans was not impulsive. It mirrored his long-standing fantasies and practices, such as animal sexual abuse, corpse desecration, morgue break-ins, all leading to these 4 murders. A cold phone call changed everything. In May 1999, Frank Gust called his mother just after midnight. His voice was flat, almost bored. He said, "Mom, I did terrible things. I hurt women." Then he hung up. No crying, no explanation, just the click of a receiver going dead. For a moment, it sounded like guilt. A confession from a man finally crumbling under the weight of his crimes. But that's not what it was. Psychologists would later explain. Gust didn't feel remorse. He didn't have empathy. He wasn't haunted by the screams of his victims or the sight of what he'd done. What he felt was pressure, not from guilt, but from the buildup, the tension of a mind that had pushed too far for too long. The call wasn't an apology. It was a release valve, a way to offload what he'd done, without emotion, without confrontation. And maybe, in some deeply warped part of him, it was a test. Would anyone stop him? When we talk about Gust feeling pressure or a build-up, we don't mean guilt or regret. We mean psychological tension that builds over time, not because he regrets what he's doing, but because the internal urge becomes harder to control, harder to satisfy, and harder to live with. This is the pattern seen in many sexually motivated serial offenders. They don't feel remorse for their actions, but they may feel overwhelmed by the intensity of their own drive. The acts escalate. The fantasies consume them. Life becomes harder to manage. So when Gust called his mother, it wasn't because he felt bad for killing. It was likely because the compulsion itself had reached a peak, and his life, marriage, work, control, was beginning to fracture under the weight of his own urges. Frank Gust did not feel remorse for the women he killed because he lacked empathy, but he did have a clear awareness that what he was doing was wrong, horrific, and escalating. And at some point, he may have realized he couldn't stop himself. He might hurt someone closer next. And maybe, just maybe, if he kept going, it would destroy the fragile, normal life he'd built. His wife, his mother, his routine. That's not remorse for his victims. It's fear of what he was becoming, and fear of collateral damage. This kind of mental state is common in high-functioning sadists and organized serial offenders. It's sometimes called cognitive remorse or strategic confession, not driven by empathy, but by a realization that their urges are spiraling beyond their control and threatening their constructed life. Dagmar Gust, his mother, told a friend what Frank had told her. That friend called the police, and just like that, the man who'd haunted the Rhine-Ruhr region for 5 years, the one the media called Der Rhine-Ruhr Ripper, stepped out of the shadows. Over 13 hours, Frank Gust confessed to 4 murders. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, precise, no emotion. He described each woman's final moments with clinical detachment, as if reading from a manual. He outlined every movement, every tool, every injury. He even corrected forensic reports, pointing out errors in their interpretation of wound angles. One detective later said it was like interviewing a surgeon with a grudge against life itself. Psychological experts were called in. Dr. Thomas Müller, one of Germany's leading criminal profilers, was struck not just by Gust's history, but by his lack of internal conflict. Gust was not psychotic. He wasn't hearing voices. He knew what he was doing was wrong. He just didn't care. Diagnosed as a sexual sadist with necrophilic fixations, Gust had a long history of compulsive violence, starting with animals. What drove him wasn't lust. It was control. The need to own someone's final breath. He once said, "Cold bodies are disappointing. I want the warmth." The psychological profile concluded that Gust had what's called a diminished sense of empathy, bordering on total emotional detachment. His fantasies of cutting open living beings had been with him since age 9. His early trauma, being sexually abused by neighborhood children and a neighbor, neglected by his family, emotionally isolated, created a void he filled with dissection, mutilation, and eventually, murder. In court, the proceedings were fast but harrowing. On 21st September 2000, Frank Gust was convicted of 4 murders and 1 case of sexual assault. He received life imprisonment and was placed under Sicherungsverwahrung, Germany's system of preventive detention for the most dangerous criminals. It means he will only be released if specialists can prove he's no longer a threat. Gust himself admitted, "I am not treatable. If I get out, I will do it again." He began therapy in prison, but quit after 6 months. He showed no remorse, no desire to change. He spends his days in isolation at Ruhr Prison, one of the country's most secure psychiatric units. According to staff, he reads obsessively and keeps to himself. One guard noted that Gust once dissected a beetle with the same fascination he once held for human organs. His next court review is scheduled for 2026, as mandated by German law. After 15 years, even the most violent prisoners are entitled to a psychological reassessment. But few expect his situation to change. His refusal of treatment, lack of remorse, and extreme pathology make his release virtually impossible. The court will reevaluate his mental state, risk of relapse, and potential for rehabilitation. But Gust has already answered those questions himself. The man who referred to people as bodies to be opened has no illusions. He is not misunderstood. He is not sorry. He is exactly what he appears to be, and the system this time will keep the cellar door shut.